Georges St-Pierre versus Anderson Silva. Ever heard of a fight so legendary it broke the internet, and then never happened? Georges St-Pierre versus Anderson Silva wasn't just a fantasy matchup. It was the fight that could have rewritten MMA history. But instead of punches, fans got press conferences, interviews, and polite deflections wrapped in Canadian diplomacy. For years, these two were the twin sons of the UFC universe. Silva ruled middleweight with front kicks, matrix dodges, and highlight reels that made opponents look like holograms. Meanwhile, GSP turned welterweight dominance into an art form. Both men cleaned out their divisions so completely that fans demanded the ultimate experiment, science versus chaos. The UFC loved the idea, and Silva said he was ready. The media drooled over the thought, but GSP hesitated. He said Silva was too big, too heavy, and too dangerous. Valid points, but Silva did cut from 210 while George weighed around 185 on his best day. Champions jump weight all the time. To fans, it looked less like logic and more like legacy protection. Privately, even Dana White pushed for it. But publicly, GSP kept it classy, claiming he would move up only if it made sense, meaning not unless the odds were perfect, and so the window closed. Silva lost his belt to Chris Weidman. GSP retired after edging Johnny Hendricks. They both went on to become legends, but their paths never crossed. Jon Jones versus Francis Ngannou. Even while GSP dodged danger in the name of legacy, Jon Jones did it in the name of luxury, and the opponent he sidestepped, none other than Francis Ngannou. The walking definition of a bad idea. For years, Jones teased his move to heavyweight like a Netflix show that never got renewed, using words like, "Soon, I'm bulking up," and everyone waited. Weeks turned to months, and months turned to years. Meanwhile, Ngannou was out there turning human beings into origami. One punch from him looked like it could reset a man's ancestry. When Ngannou finally claimed the heavyweight crown by destroying Stipe Miocic in 2021, the world called for one thing: Jones versus Ngannou, the unstoppable force versus the untouchable technician. The fans demanded, but Jones, he didn't sign it as he priced himself out for $30 million. It sounded less like negotiation and more like escape disguised as economics. Ngannou called his bluff, claiming Jon talks too much and he doesn't want the smoke. And the longer the talks dragged on, the worse it looked. Twitter memes declared it official. The GOAT had ghosted the Predator. Jones later made his heavyweight debut, but only after Ngannou left the UFC. Suddenly, the monster in the shadows was gone. He fought Cyril Gane instead and looked brilliant, but everyone remembered what didn't happen. Because in fight sports, timing is everything. And this one felt perfectly mistimed by design. It turns out even the greatest can hesitate when the danger punches harder than the paycheck. Michael Bisping versus Yoel Romero. Did you know the UFC once had a champion who ducked his scariest challenger so hard the guy literally aged into another title shot before getting one? Sounds dramatic, but that's exactly what happened when Michael Bisping sidestepped Yoel Romero. Romero wasn't just another contender. He was a middleweight wrecking ball. Knockouts over Chris Weidman and Luke Rockhold turned him into the division's boogeyman. The night he flattened Rockhold, Bisping was cage-side with beer in hand, smirking from a VIP box. Romero looked up, shouted his love, and promised to see him soon. Bisping responded with the middle finger, a perfectly British "no thank you." What followed wasn't quite ducking in the literal sense, but it sure looked like it. Instead of defending his title against the Cuban powerhouse, Bisping called out 46-year-old Dan Henderson, a legend who had lost 6 of his last 9 fights. It was the combat sports equivalent of a heavyweight champion skipping Tyson Fury to box his retired gym coach. The fight sold nostalgia, but not legitimacy. When Bisping survived Henderson and kept the belt, everyone expected Romero next, but instead he pivoted again, this time toward Georges St-Pierre, a welterweight who had been retired for nearly 4 years because he was a blockbuster. Bisping publicly claimed Romero didn't deserve the shot, citing his USADA controversies. But let's be honest, the timing was convenient. Romero was the #1 contender, terrifyingly explosive, and probably the worst stylistic matchup Bisping could imagine. Even Bisping's rivals called it what it was, a self-preservation wrapped in PR spin. In the end, Bisping lost his belt to GSP, who promptly vacated it. Unfortunately, Romero never got his crack at the count. While Bisping tried so hard to avoid him, the same can be said about Tyron Woodley. Tyron Woodley versus Colby Covington. Did you know Tyron Woodley once dodged Colby Covington so many times it turned into an MMA urban legend? It sounds exaggerated, but before they ever touched gloves, the Chosen One spent nearly 2 years doing everything but fighting the man, calling him out daily. At one point, Covington wasn't just the loudmouth heel of the division, but he soon became the interim welterweight champion. After outclassing Rafael dos Anjos in 2018, he was supposed to unify the belt against Woodley in a perfect setup, Red Hat versus Rap Star, Villain versus Champ. But then the matchup disappeared out of thin air. Woodley claimed he was injured, but Covington said he was ducking. Both might be true, but the timeline didn't lie. When Covington's surgery delayed his return, the UFC pivoted, booking Woodley against Darren Till instead. The self-proclaimed Chaos accused Woodley of hiding behind politics and paydays, saying the champ was more interested in TMZ than TKO. It didn't end there. When the UFC tried again to pair them up through The Ultimate Fighter, Covington swore the contract was signed on his end, but that Woodley wouldn't commit. Woodley stayed quiet, instead campaigning for money fights against Nate or Nick Diaz. At this point, it was proof that he was terrified, knowing Covington would end that reign before he could post another rap verse. Ironically, when the two finally met years later, long after Woodley had lost his belt, it wasn't the blockbuster fans once imagined. Covington dominated, breaking Woodley's rib in the 5th round and putting an emphatic end to the saga. Ronda Rousey versus Chris Cyborg. If Woodley dodged chaos for his reputation, then Ronda Rousey ducked destruction. And in her case, that destruction was named Chris Cyborg. At the height of her dominance, Rousey was the UFC's golden myth. But Cyborg was the monster lurking just beyond Ronda's weight class. She is bigger, stronger, and terrifyingly violent. For years, fans begged for it. Rousey versus Cyborg. Queen versus Conqueror. It was the female version of Mayweather-Pacquiao before Mayweather-Pacquiao even happened. But while Cyborg screamed for the fight, Ronda stayed put. She kept saying Cyborg can make 135 if she wants to face her. Cyborg, who had spent her career at featherweight with 145 pounds, said dropping that far would destroy her body. So, neither side blinked. To the UFC, Ronda's argument made business sense, but it looked like she was protecting her aura. Cyborg was starching opponents in under a minute, while Rousey was tapping them in 30 seconds. So the collision was inevitable, until it wasn't. Every time it came close, the conversation ended with the same wall. By 2015, Rousey had cleaned out bantamweight. Meanwhile, Cyborg was smashing through Invicta like a wrecking ball auditioning for a Marvel movie. The UFC teased, promoted, and hinted, but Ronda never moved an inch. When Ronda eventually fell to Holly Holm, fans couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if she had stepped up. Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Tony Ferguson. If Ronda ducked danger with a smile, Khabib's next story feels like the universe itself did the ducking for him. Because while Rousey avoided one unstoppable woman, Khabib Nurmagomedov and Tony Ferguson were two unstoppable forces that somehow never collided, no matter how many times they were supposed to meet. This was the purists' dream matchup. Khabib's suffocating Sambo versus Tony's chaos. Discipline versus delirium. The immovable mountain versus the man who tried to climb it while bleeding. This event was booked 5 times and canceled 5 times. Every MMA fan can recite the list like a bedtime horror story. During the first booking, Khabib's knee blew out. In the second booking, Tony got hurt. Third time, another injury. Fourth, Ferguson tore his LCL tripping over a cable during fight week. And the fifth, Khabib got stranded in Russia during the pandemic, while Tony trained alone and cut weight for a fight that never came. If irony could tap you out, this was it. When Khabib finally retired undefeated after submitting Justin Gaethje, fans couldn't let it go. He had beaten everyone except the one man who thrived in madness. Some say he retired before the chaos could find him. Others say the chaos found Tony instead. Either way, one of MMA's greatest fights lives only in imagination. Conor McGregor versus Frankie Edgar. If Khabib versus Tony was the fight cursed by the MMA gods, then Conor McGregor versus Frankie Edgar was the one dodged by design, a ghost that McGregor himself seemed happy never to chase. Because while Khabib's fight fell apart 5 times by fate, Conor's never even got close. And that's exactly why fans called it a duck. Edgar wasn't flashy, just relentless wrestling and an engine that didn't stop. He was the kind of fighter who could drown you for 5 rounds, and Conor knew it. When McGregor starched Jose Aldo in 13 seconds, the division froze. Frankie was next in line. Everyone knew it, but instead of defending the belt against the wrestler everyone said could break him, Conor aimed higher, literally. He jumped divisions, chasing lightweight gold and money fights instead of mandatory defenses. He fought Eddie Alvarez and Donald Cerrone, but not Frankie Edgar. Fans saw it as strategic genius or strategic avoidance, depending on who you asked. Conor said it was business, but it was clear as day that McGregor picked strikers he could style on, not wrestlers who would chain takedown him into exhaustion. Even Dana White admitted timing never lined up, but it was hard to ignore how perfectly it didn't. Frankie just kept showing up. Eventually, McGregor moved on, Edgar aged out, and the matchup became one of those what-ifs that haunts highlight reels. So the next time someone says McGregor feared no man, remember that sometimes the biggest duck isn't about running away, it's about choosing where to fly. Israel Adesanya versus Jon Jones. Did you know the last stylebender once promised to fight Jon Jones in 2021, but when the year came and went, so did Jones. For 2 years, the MMA world was hypnotized by a rivalry that never caught fire. Adesanya and Jones were built for each other. Artist versus outlaw, technique versus terror. They traded barbs, memes, and promises across Twitter like it was pay-per-view. Jones called Izzy a fake tough guy. Adesanya fired back with steroid jabs and anime quotes. It was trash talk that felt personal, and fans ate it up like pre-fight popcorn. However, during the timeline, Jones vacated his light heavyweight throne to bulk up for heavyweight. Adesanya said he would see him in 2021, but instead of moving up when Jones was waiting, Izzy stayed put at 185, cleaning house but never crossing weight class lines. When Adesanya finally jumped to 205, Jones was long gone. It was the fight that should have crowned an era, but ended as a myth. Amanda Nunes versus Cyborg. Rematch. If Jon Jones and Israel Adesanya was the super fight that never happened, Amanda Nunes versus Chris Cyborg 2 was the one that should have. Because when the Lioness slayed the Queen of Chaos in just 51 seconds, fans wanted confirmation. One clean right hand ended Cyborg's 13-year unbeaten streak at UFC 232, and just like that, the monster under every bantamweight's bed was gone. It was shocking, violent, and historic. But when Cyborg begged for a rematch, the door slammed shut. Nunes said she had already proved her point, but that reasoning didn't sit right with fans. This was Chris Cyborg, the human wrecking ball who had steamrolled legends. A single round isn't enough, and that's what made it sting. Cyborg called for a second fight over and over, even offering to sign short-term deals to make it happen. Nunes shrugged it off, saying she was done at featherweight. Then, quietly, the UFC released Cyborg altogether. On one hand, it looked like smart business, but on the other hand, it smelled like a duck wrapped in PR spin. Cyborg was chaos, incarnate of power, pressure, and danger. Meanwhile, Nunes had nothing left to prove, but maybe something left to fear. It's a weird paradox where the GOAT beat her greatest threat, then refused to face her again. Demetrious Johnson versus TJ Dillashaw. While Amanda Nunes outrightly shut the door on a rematch, Demetrious Johnson built a fortress around him. At the peak of his reign, Demetrious Mighty Mouse Johnson said no to TJ Dillashaw at flyweight, and the MMA world lost its collective mind. Technically, it was perfect. Champion versus champion, skill for skill, maybe the most technical fight the UFC could have booked, but Johnson wasn't buying it. He argued that TJ had never fought at 125, and if Dillashaw missed weight, the UFC would strip him of his title and scrap the fight, costing him both payday and prestige. TJ was begging for the fight. The UFC was hyping it, but Johnson chose to defend against Ray Borg instead. And when TJ later made 125 to fight Henry Cejudo and got starched in under a minute, critics couldn't help but circle back. Maybe Johnson was right all along, and that's the strange irony of ducking in MMA. Sometimes it's not fear, it's foresight. Because in this sport, timing is everything. One wrong fight can erase a legacy faster than anything else.